everybody to the first seminar of the Standing Group on the EU of this academic year. So I'm Nathalie Brack from the ULB, and together with Jonathan Zeitling from the University of Amsterdam, we organize this seminar every third Thursday of the month. And today we have the pleasure to have Gilles Pittoors for a presentation entitled Parties Between Nations Introducing the European Multi-Level Party Field, where we present a new framework to study party politics in the EU. Gilles is lecturer in European politics and society at the University of Groningen, guest lecturer at the ULB, and postdoctoral researcher at the University of Ghent. To discuss his paper, we have the pleasure of having Ben Crum from the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. So Gilles, you will have the floor for about 30 to 40 minutes to present your ideas and paper, and then you will receive the comments and suggestions from Ben Crum for 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Nathalie, for that introduction, and thank you to you and Jonathan for hosting me. It's a real honor to present my work here. I'm going to start with a short disclaimer. So this is a really work in progress. So it's an idea that I've been developing over the past few months, and it's really the first time I've put it on paper, and I'm presenting to a bigger audience. So I'm very curious to hear your thoughts and the comments and feedback I will be getting from the audience. So what's the paper about? Basically, it starts from an observation that the EU has been developing over the past decades these Euro parties, and more recently it has also been supporting the idea of transnational lists. And from that, I've been thinking about the fact that the EU is actually trying to solve its own democratic deficit by moving towards a party democracy. Now, the idea of European parties was introduced about 30 years ago, specifically with the aim of connecting national citizens to EU politics and European political decisions. As an answer to a perceived democratic deficit of the EU. The EU is perceived to lack a connection with its citizens. National member states have given a lot of policy competence to the EU, but it has not been accompanied with democratic legitimation by EU citizens. Now, it's quite common in federal systems for political parties to take on this role as bridge between citizens and political decisions. We've seen for research in Germany, US, Canada, a lot of scholars have sort of thought about political parties as mediating and as civilizing actors, connecting not only the citizens across levels up to the federal level, but also across different territories. So both in the vertical and horizontal way, political parties are seen as bridges holding together the multi-level system or the federal system, and also civilizing conflicts between citizens in different territories and between actors at different levels. And it's from that idea also that the EU has been looking into developing its own kind of party democracy, supporting European political parties or Euro parties, and more recently also introducing the idea of transnational lists for the European elections. Now, the question I've been asking myself about this is, does that party democracy model, does that really work for the EU? And part of the reason why I've been asking that question is because that democracy model, party democracy model itself, has been under pressure at the national level, at the member state level, where it is the main model for the way democracy works. But we see that national parties, they're actually under pressure. You see that they are losing membership. There's a low turnout at national elections, also at European elections. There's a rise of radical parties, authoritarian parties, people, citizens, it seems, are actually turning away from national parties and from this model of party democracy. At the same time, we can also see that Euro parties themselves are actually virtually invisible for citizens, despite being under development for many decades. If you ask the average European citizen about the Spitzenkandidaten system, most of them will have no clue what you're talking about. And although Euro parties are developing for sure, and they have an important role to play at the European level, the prime purpose for which they were created, namely connecting back to the European citizens, connecting Europe to European citizens, is actually not really working. Which brought me to think, like, do we maybe need some kind of other model? Do we need some kind of other way of looking at political parties, at European political parties, that is not starting from the assumption that you can sort of just build, create a European Parliament and European political parties at the European level and sort of expect it to trickle down to the national level? You know, this idea of a trickle-down democracy, which Europe expected to develop over the years, hasn't really happened so far. So is there another model that of political parties that we can think of? And that's basically the argument I'm trying to make in this paper, the argument that we do need a new party model for the EU. And the reason why I think the existing models don't really work is because they don't really overlap with the reality of the reality of European political party politics. If we think about European political parties, there's often two sort of big models that we refer to, or that we compare them to. On the one hand, there's the federal model, right, where we compare them to parties in Germany, the US, Canada, or other federal systems. But of course, European political parties, they don't really work that way. They are not federal parties in the same way that the EU is not a typical federation, right? Federal parties are often quite hierarchically organized, where you have one federal parties and then sort of local branches or regional branches of that party, right? But Euro parties, they're not European parties with national branches of that European party. It's basically the other way around, right? You've got a lot of national parties, and they came together at the European level to create something, a thing that brings them together, right? So this top-down federal model doesn't really capture, doesn't really work for the EU. But the problem is that the alternative model that a lot of people might refer to also doesn't work. This alternative is a network model, where European parties are compared to things like the Socialist International or the Liberal International, these internationals, which are essentially little more than loose gatherings of national parties with a very weak organizational structure, and are in many ways actually quite non-committal. I mean, it's quite easy to if you're a socialist party, you become a member of the Socialist International, so to speak, but there is not a lot of commitment demanded from that international to become a member, nor does it have a lot of influence on what its member parties actually do. So I've been thinking more about this. Is there something else? Is there something in between the federal model and that network model, that an alternative party model that we can see, that we can think of, that actually works for the EU, right? A model that is at the same time non-hierarchical, right? not hierarchically top-down structured, but still structured in a way, structured much more than a loose network, non-committal network of national parties. At the same time, I think that model should also consider that political parties in the EU, they're not just looking up and down, they're also looking sideways, to use the words by Amy Kreppel, right? They don't look up, not just up and down, also sideways. And that's another, I think, shortcoming of the existing model. So when you look at the federal model, that's often in the up-down dimension, right? You look in the vertical dimension, where there's a a higher level in the party and a lower level in the party, and it's about power struggles between these two levels in a vertical direction. While the network model looks almost primarily at the horizontal dimension, where you've got dimensions between different parties at the national level, but that's pretty horizontal. But in the EU, it's not just about national parties looking sideways towards each other and seeing what they can do together, etc. It's also about up and down. It's also about, okay, what's happening at the European level, and how do we manage our relations in that vertical dimension, right? So we need a model, I think, that answers to these criteria. You know, it's not hierarchical, but still structures, and allows us to think about party politics in Europe in a way that looks in all directions at the same time, right? And that's where I came up with the idea of a field, and it's the field approach. Of course, I didn't invent the warm water with the field approach. I actually came up with the idea of thinking about a party field, reading the work by Ben Crum and Jan-Erik Vossen when they talked about the parliamentary field. But then I thought, like, well, if parliaments in Europe work in a field, then parties probably do too, right? And I think this field approach is actually answers pretty good the requirements of a model a party model in the EU, non-hierarchical but structured, and working all directions at the same time. And my next slide, I'll go a little bit deeper into that idea of what a multi-level field, party field, actually is. So it starts from the idea that political parties are not actually singular units, but constitutive units of a European superstructure, right? I use this metaphor in the paper where I say that we have been looking at, especially national political parties, as if they are little islands in a big European sea, right? And sometimes these islands, you know, they cooperate or they battle with other islands in that European sea, but they essentially remain singular, autonomous little islands. But I think that's a wrong way of looking at it. It's probably better to look at political parties in Europe as if they are an archipelago. You know, they're all part. Yes, we can see them individually as islands. Yes, but it's impossible to really understand what's happening at one island without considering the fact that they are actually part of a larger whole. In the same way as you cannot understand the archipelago, the bigger whole in itself, without understanding what's happening at the individual islands, right? So using that metaphor, well, that metaphor basically expresses the idea of the field, that parties are not singular units, but they constitute together a bigger European structure, right? And a field in field theory has, you know, has a very long history, and a field is essentially a community of organizations that partake of a common meaning system and interact more frequently with people inside than outside the field. So if we apply that definition of a field to party politics in Europe, we can consider that the party field is a collective of national parties that at the European level converge around some common ideology or common interest or common idea, right? And have formalized their relationships in the form of Euro parties or European parliamentary groups, which are the central organizations of the field, right? And thinking of political parties in this way, thinking about them as if they are part of a field which allows them some certain degree of autonomy and agency, yet also provides enough structure. Thinking about it in this way allows us to focus on the interactions that happen all the time in all directions between the different units of the field, or between the different parties in the field, right? Both horizontally and vertically, all at the same time. And the added value is that this field approach basically circumvents the structure agency debate by acknowledging both, essentially, right? It acknowledges the fact that Euro parties have an influence as these central institutions, and also acknowledges that being part of a European party federation, for example, being part of the European People's Party, it actually has a kind of a binding character. You subscribe to a party program, you subscribe to the Spitzenkandidaten process, etc. You subscribe to a group in the European Parliament. At the same time, it also acknowledges the fact that none of these relations, none of these interactions between parties, also not between the Euro Party and the National Party, are hierarchical, right? They're quite horizontal, these relations, in the sense that it's not very clear which one is the agent and the principal, so to speak, right? They both influence each other, and it's more a matter of how these different agents, how these different units, sorry, in the field interact with each other, right? But then, of course, the question still is, like, how do these interactions in the field, is there, if they're occurring in all directions at the same time, if it's all about the interaction, if it's all about both structure and agency, what kind of dynamics actually determine and can help us to understand and maybe even explain the way these interactions occur. And field theory here actually has three basic ideas about how interactions within the field are structured. The first thing is that they look at the regulatory framework. The regulatory framework can be seen as the together with the normative framework, can be seen as a structure of the field. Regulatory framework are the rules of the game, the internal decision-making procedures, and the extent also to which these are democratic or non-democratic. And an important element here are these field configuring events. Think, for example, about the Congress of a European party, where all the bigwigs of the European Party, but also all the national party representatives are come together, where they exchange ideas, where they actually make decisions about the rules of the game, right? But also provide these events, these congresses and other events, similar types of events. They also provide opportunities for exchange between the different members of the field, and also for a dynamic of socialization among its units. And this regulatory field, of course, is not the only kind of structural element of the field. There's also a normative framework, or what is called a habitus in field theory. And whereas the regulatory framework is all about the rules of the game, the normative framework is more about dominant ideas about how things should be. For example, what should we be doing together as national political parties, right? What should the role of the Euro Party be? What kind of topics should we be deciding together? What kind of topics should we be deciding on our own, right? And should we have a Spitzenkandidaten process? Should we have all subscribe to the same party program, for example? Those kind of questions. But it's also a question about ideology and belonging. What kind of party belongs in our little group, right? When is especially, for example, the EPP has had this I think important debate, like, where does the center right end and where does the more radical right start? They had the problem with Fidesz, for example. That's part of the also of the habitus, you know. Where do we draw the line of our ideology, of the common idea, the common interest that actually brought us together in the first place? Where do we draw the line, and which parties are a member, which are not a member, right? That's also part of the normative framework and the habitus of a field. And you can I think argue that if the habitus of the field is actually quite weak, if this normative framework is weak in the sense that there is only a very thin ideology holding parties together, then it's going to be very difficult for a Euro party to actually act decisively and act in a united way. While if the habitus is quite strong, you know, there's a very strong normative ideological ties bringing parties together, at least the Euro party, is going to be a lot more able to act in a united way, and national parties will be less inclined to diverge from what is decided together. But that's an argument you could make. Now, so far, we've mainly been talking about the structural element of the field, right? Regulatory framework, normative framework. But there's also an agency of the individual units, and that's where the capital comes in, right? Capital of individual units within the field, they refer to material resources, but also immaterial ones. Crum and Fustom highlight knowledge, experience, authority, and you can think of several more probably. And of course, these are relative to the field. For example, the German CDU, right, can be extremely influential as an individual unit within the European People's Party, if only just because of their sheer size, right? They have so much material resources, but also so much human resources. They just have a lot of votes. They have a lot of people to send to the EPP and its Congress and to the European Parliament and EPP group there. So they're influential, right? That's just the sheer size of the CDU. But there are also other ways of gaining capital. If we look, for example, if we stay within the EPP family and we look at the Flemish Christian Democrats, for example, they've had the longest serving EPP president. They've had the first EPP president of the European Council, right? Herman van Rompuy. They've had a lot of very influential people within the EPP, despite being actually very small, in the European context at least, a very small Flemish Christian Democratic Party, but they have invested so much time and energy over the many decades in the EPP that they've actually built up a lot of capital, despite being small. So there is this historical element, but there's also an individual element. People like Tusk or Guy Verhofstadt, for example, right? They have individual careers which give them, at the individual level even, a lot of weight and a lot of capital within their respective fields. And finally, a thing I'd like to highlight is also that this capital, is also relative to which level you're talking about. Someone who had a lot of capital at the European level might not necessarily have that much capital left when they're moving back to the national level, right? You can think of a number of national politicians who might have a whole career in the European Parliament, but might be of noble insignificance when they return back to the national level, right? So based on field theory, I try to argue in my paper that looking at European party politics as a field, at parties as constitutive units of a larger whole, a larger whole that is defined by rules, norms, and capital of individual units, that's actually a good way of capturing the reality of European party politics in Europe, and also tentatively, although I'm still not, there's a lot of things I need to work out there, of course, but also tentatively argue that you could actually explain party politics using this approach. Now, the last few minutes of my presentation, I'd like to focus on how we can go from using this concept to a research agenda, because obviously I mean, theoretically you can say like, well, we have to look in all directions, like we have to look at interactions vertically, horizontally, and that sounds great, but there are, of course, a lot of different kinds of real life interactions within such a field that you can grasp. And can we really make a model that can sort of capture, let alone explain all of them, right? It's quite ambitious, I'm aware, and I've been trying to think of a number of indicators or a number of characteristics of these kinds of interaction that can help us to map out what kind of interactions are possible within such a field, to help us maybe create different categories of interaction that can not only help us to identify what is out there, but also identify maybe where research is still lacking, where there is still not, which areas we have not been studying enough so far. And I've been thinking about these 5 indicators, which is direction of interaction. You've got in the horizontal or in the vertical direction. But there's also type of interaction, interactive arrangements. You can have parties unilaterally acting across borders, across levels. You can do it. You can have them acting bilaterally. For example, you can have the German Greens and the French Greens working together, organizing a joint event, for example, on a bilateral level. You can also have this in a multilateral way, where we actually involve the entire field, right, the entire Euro party, and parties engage with each other multilaterally. The third characteristic I think is relevant is the form of interaction. Are we talking here about programmatic interaction or organizational interaction? Programmatic, I'm thinking more in terms of policy diffusion, exchange of policy ideas between parties, whereas organizational is more in terms of concrete organization of particular events, right? Or exchange of best practices in terms of organization of campaigns, or real like physical exchange of personnel. For example, very recently, one of the big shots in the Flemish Green political party actually went to work for the Dutch Greens for a few months, right? That's kind of a sort of a personnel exchange. That's kind of the organizational element. Fourth element I've been looking at is the aim, because obviously parties are not going to interact across levels and across borders just for the sake of it, right? They try to achieve something, right? And there I think you can have different kind of elements ranging from socialization to actual supervision, right? Socialization being they want to get to know each other, they want to exchange ideas, maybe even best practices. While supervision is really in terms of they're going to try to, issue some kind of control over another unit in the field, maybe even the field's central institutions, right? And then finally, there's also the element of the method of impact in the sense that I don't know if method is the good word. I didn't know what other words to use, but probably there's a better one out there. But I was just thinking that the impact of this kind of interaction on the national party can also work in different ways. You can have a direct impact, parties immediately changing, for example, their own positions at the national level because of participation or because of a decision made in the field or at the Euro party level, for example. It's a direct change. We can also have indirect effects, parties changing their identities, changing their ideological identity over time because of socialization within a Euro party. Now, very clearly, I want to say that this is really just the very first attempt at identifying a number of what I think might be useful indicators of this sort of transnationalization of political parties. It's definitely not some kind of ultimate list of things we need to study, but I really like to hear your thoughts on that. And if I have a little bit more time, because I don't really know how long I've been talking so far, but if I have a little bit more time, I'd like to end with a discussion of the normative dimension of the party field. Because obviously, when we're debating models of political parties, when we're debating the EU's democratic deficit, there's a very strong normative dimension about it. Like, how can we think of democracy itself, and how can we think of a model of democracy that could actually work for the EU? And I'm sure there are people present here who are much better versed in the debate than I am. But the way I've seen the debates develop over the past few years is that there's a clear distinction to me between those people who support the idea of an EU democracy itself and those who are more in favor of a democracy, right? the latter group, they basically see the EU as a compound of national demo, national democracies. And there is this idea that because there is no one common European people, one common European demos, there can never really be a European and one single EU democracy. And it's actually considered a goal not worth pursuing. And the best thing we can hope for is for the different national democracies to, work together in some way. On the other hand, there's a group of people saying that, well, EU democracy, maybe there is no European people. That's true. There is no one European people, but it can be constructed through what Higgs has called the democratic praxis, simply by actually doing politics across levels, doing transnational politics, doing supranational politics, will create over time, or has the potential, the transformative potential for this sort of European demos to actually be created. And political parties are actually great vehicles for this democratic practice, for connecting citizens. And that then I connect back to my opening slide. Political parties are actually considered as very good vehicles for connecting citizens across levels, across territories, horizontally and vertically, right? Now, I'm not choosing, so to speak, I'm not arguing for one or the other, but actually the way I've been looking at it is that a field approach maybe is a sort of a golden way in between, in the sense that it actually maybe it does both. Maybe it works very good as a model also because it actually acknowledges that national democracies are indeed the building blocks of a European party democracy, right? It's all about these units of national politics coming together at the European level and forming a new, bigger whole. So yes, right? I think the field approach might actually be very good at capturing this democratic reality of the EU today. But at the same time, it leaves open the door, right, towards the more towards EU democracy, towards the development towards an EU democracy, because it also recognizes, I think, the transformative potential of transnational politics and transnational party activities, right? In the sense that it provides, I think, political parties with a model of transnational action that would allow them to move in the direction of or to provide the EU with a solid anchoring and a solid foundation for developing towards a European demos and an EU party democracy. So that was it, very briefly. Thank you so much for, well, not that briefly actually, but still, thank you so much for your time and for listening. And I'm very much looking forward to all your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Gilles, and don't worry, you were perfectly into the timing we've set, so you were not too long at all, and it was a very interesting and intriguing research proposal. So I will leave the floor to Ben Crum for 5 to 10 minutes of questions and feedback and comments.
Question? Yeah, but you can remove the slide, I guess. But I do have some questions, at least 3, or at least I have clustered them around 3 blocks. I really like the papers. It's really ambitious, which is always dangerous. I mean, the most ambitious papers don't get published. We all know. But it really is very thought-provoking. I think there's something happening in every section that's nice, that triggers your mind and say, well, would this work? How would this work? And in that sense, it's really a pleasure to read it. And of course, I mean, yes, together with John Eric Vossen, we have been playing with the field notion ourselves, and it's nice to see that it also inspires other people. And actually, I think you're using it in a very interesting way, because you're really asking this fundamental question indeed: how, or should we rethink this very fundamental concept, this very fundamental actor, political parties, in the context of the European Union? And I think that's a great question. And I think the realization that in an internationalizing context, that the units that we have, the concepts that we have, cannot simply be uploaded. So we make a state and we make it a super state. We have parties and we make it, well, super parties, federal parties. but that actually what's happening is much more in a way holistic. You nicely talked about the interaction between agency and structure here, that actually, since the context changes, the nature of the constituting unions is affected. I think that's a very interesting approach, and I think it's very relevant and under-recognized. And it reminds me, I think, a wonderful example of this is Chris Bickerton's phrase from nation states to member states. So he basically describes indeed how, well, what he classically thought about nation states are in their identity, in their very deep sense of being, transformed by the context of Europeanization. And I guess some kind of similar strategy or aim is what we had, John Erik Vosman and I, when we introduced this notion of a field, that we cannot simply upload our existing concept to the European context. We actually have to realize how the European context itself transforms has to transform our thinking, and that we need new concepts rather than to stick to the old. So I think that, and that you do this with a focus on parties, which I think is interesting because they're more agential, I guess, than states or even than parliaments, is I think a fascinating challenge, and I think it has the potential to be really productive. And I also like the way that you sketched. You didn't do this in the presentation now. You have these 4 generations in a way of party analysis in EU studies, and how this kind of leads to the 4th phase, where indeed we start to look sideways about transnational influences between parties. Now, of course, the big question is indeed this term, European multilevel party field. What does it mean? How does it work? And indeed, how can it lead us to ask new questions and to come up with new findings and new assessments of the present? And I think there I have questions around three issues. My first issue is very much about the object. What is it? And are you sure you want to define it the way that you would define it? The second one is more indeed about where's the focus of the research agenda. And the last one is about the normative dimension. And on all three, I'm going to be a bit of the advocate of the devil. I'm going to challenge you to turn something around. So on what's the object? So you define, and you did this also was also one of the slides. You define this European multilevel parliamentary field as a collective of national parties that at the European level converge around a common ideology or other set of political norms and interests, and formalize their relations in the form of Euro parties or EP groups. And later on you say, so basically each major party family can be considered a separate field. So basically you're not talking about one field, and that was a bit confusing for me. Actually, I anticipate that actually you would, that the object would, in a way, what you can say is the party system at the European level. But you decide in the end that it's not the party system as a whole, but rather that indeed each party group constitutes a little field of its own. And I'm not sure. I think I would, well, I was inclined to go back to my initial intuition that what we're talking about, the constitution of Euro parties, is as much, I think, taking place between party groups as it is within them. So I would actually upload this whole notion of a field and say, really, this field operates on the totality of national and European parties who influence each other. And there's, of course, there's also a lot of mimicking going on between the European party groups. The socialists look at the Christian Democrats. How do they do things? They develop their own scientific bureaus at the European level. The way that they organize the Spitzenkandidat nominations. There are different, Wouter Wolfs has done wonderful analysis of that. There are different procedures, but they also look at each other and they learn from each other. And of course, also the parties together formulate the rules by which resources are allocated within the European Parliament procedures, and even indeed financial decisions and financial subsidies to parties at the European level under which conditions they're to be allocated. So there, I think there's regulatory construction taking place between and across the parties. There's normative dynamics going on between and across the parties, and there are certainly also issues of capital and power inequalities that operate across party groups rather than only within them. So I would advocate that stick to one field and make it a big one. But it's an issue to be discussed. I mean, I'm very curious why at this point, and related to that, I think the question is very much that you bring this ideological element. And I'm not sure. I mean, I'm inclined, also if you go back to the classical sociological literature, to define fields in terms of functions, and not and to be in a way agnostic about any different values that different actors in that field may have. So basically what we're looking at is indeed, collective actors that try to sell policies and get votes for them, for that. And so I'm not sure whether I would introduce this ideological dimension in the definition in the first place, but that's a side note on my wider. Is the field a party system equivalent, or is the party equivalent? You suggest that it's a party group equivalent, but I would rather challenge you and say, well, why not upload it all the way to the party system? Second question is about the analytical framework or the research agenda. What are we looking for, and where does this get interesting, and what kind of data should we start to collect to get to new insights? And here I think it's also, this is of course also the crucial test whether this notion really has added value over the two notions that we have. So you have the federal model, that seems to be your main antagonist with which to start off, but also the network model as a secondary antagonist. You don't develop those alternatives fully. I mean, you only use them kind of as to criticize, but maybe I think in another version I would give them a bit more credit and to construct them a bit like this is what they can do, but this is also where they reach the limits. But anyway, I think what's striking is, and if you come to the research agenda, you identify these 5 dimensions, no? Direction, type, form, aim, and method of impact. And it's all about charting interactions between parties in the field. This looks very much like a network approach in the end. I'm not sure that you're really fully exploiting this more integrative, holistic dimension of, and I'm also thinking a bit, yeah, of course, these are all things that you can count, and you can create wonderful databases, and maybe the European Commission wants to sponsor that. But still, I'm not really sure. What are we going to find out? That some parties have more interactions than others, are better networked, and then again, what does that really mean? So I was a bit like, yes, this can be done, but it's not, I think, where I get enthusiastic. Actually, where I got enthusiastic, so this is in a way, again, where I turn it around, I would say the preceding section where you start to describe these 3 concepts of regulations, norms, and capital. These ask for a lot of operationalization still. You give intuitive examples, but the question is, how can we measure? How can we track? How can we operationalize the notion of regulatory frameworks and the density of the regulatory framework across the field and across different parties? I think there's a lot of questions there about how do these rules emerge, who sets them, what kind of procedures are agreed. So there's plenty of work there. The same goes, of course, for norms. The question indeed, how do you get recognized as a member of this field? How do you indeed get affiliated to a party group? Is there a tendency towards cartelization? I mean, we know about cartelization at the national level. To what extent indeed do the European party groups use the devices that they have within the parliament and also to financial resources, allocation, subsidies, to limit access and all that? And of course, the question of capital. Can you make this measurable? Can you really, intuitively it all makes sense that you say that, of course, the Christian Democrats, the CDU is the biggest party here. But how can you compare that? Can you say that, for instance, the differences in capital are bigger among the Renew group than in the Christian Democrats? So I think actually those 3 themes, for me, are the most fascinating research agenda. And they are at the heart of the distinctive notion of what's different about the field, rather than being just kind of a network approach writ large, if I can put it provocatively. And finally, normative. Yeah, I think this is, so in the paper, you say that, well, the field is intrinsically a normative concept. I'm not sure. The thing is, of course, I mean, I'm traumatized because I've often had this debate about our own parliamentary field. And people think that that's a normative notion. And I've always tried to, I mean, of course, I'm a very normative person and a lot of my research is very normative. But I would say we always try to develop the parliamentary field as an analytical device, to step back from all kinds of normative reason purposes and say, let's first look what's going on. Let's completely drop all kinds of assumptions of where this has to go. So indeed, there's no federal telos. It doesn't have to end up like a federation. It also is not bound to remain something like indeed intergovernmental network. It's somewhere in between, and let's first just start to chart what's going on. Let's just start to look and allow for all kind of middle points, and then only after that we can start to say, well, is this justifiable? Is this normatively right? Is this democratic? Or maybe this is problematic. But I would say, I think one of the big virtues is actually that while somebody like Hicks, of course, always pretends that he's very empirical and non-normative, of course, his original research agenda was very teleological and normative about that Europe was bound to become a federation. You have the, in a way, the added value that you can say, step back and say, well, I'm not committed to a federation. I'm not committed to an intergovernment. I'm just looking what's going on. And it's somewhere in the middle. However, if you say that this is normative dimension, then you're kind of saying, well, it is what we have at present is as good as it gets. We're kind of stuck in this kind of in between. I'm not sure about that either. And I certainly wouldn't normatively validate it. I mean, if you find big differentials in capital, if you indeed find that the CDU is by far the most powerful national party, how can you democratically justify that? And not a German Europe. So I would not give that a normative place. I would just simply say, well, the field kind of opens our minds to identify this, to measure that. And then you have independent, not intrinsic, but independent normative criteria about political equality. And those normative criteria may indeed be derived from a notion of democracy. I don't know what democracy is. There's many people having different concepts of democracy, but, or indeed, if you like, a federal conception. But you need, I think, I would rather externalize any democratic standards and then introduce them later on. But first, let's use this notion to look at the dynamics that are taking place and the variety that takes place, and then come up with independent criteria about, is this indeed furthering inclusion, political equality, deliberation, and justification, the kind of norms that are intrinsic to democracy. So basically, I'm challenging you, and maybe a bit as a devil's advocate, to say, well, make it a party system rather than a party concept. Focus your research agenda on the typical field notion, capital, norms, and rules, rather than on 5 rather individualized dimensions, and go for an analytical rather than a normative approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Gilles, if you want to briefly come back to Ben's comment, and then we will open up the floor for questions and comments.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Ben, for this really good feedback. I think I'll start with the last comment and go back to the first. So on the normative dimension, I think you're actually right in terms of how we should proceed in developing this. I think it is a model that really allows us to have a look at what's going on first, and that's something we should definitely do first. But what I meant when I said that it has an intrinsic normative dimension is not necessarily that it prescribes a particular idea of democracy, but rather that it opens a number of questions about democracy, because it is actually, I agree with you, like the question is this really as good as it gets, right? Because I think personally the model is quite apt at capturing the current reality, right, of parties looking in directions and being part of a field, non-hierarchical and all that. I think it's quite good at capturing that reality. But that does open a question like, does this, I mean, is such a party field sufficient enough as a democratic foundation for the EU? That's what I meant with it has this intrinsic normative value. Like it does open up this question, like if this is as good as it gets, you know, I mean, what does it mean for the EU as a democracy and also for its future development? Now, it's definitely an idea I need to think about, but I think we're actually more on the same wavelength than it would seem at first sight. Then the second point, there I would actually also agree with you in the sense that I would really like to develop more indeed on these regulatory normative frameworks on how to operationalize those. The reason I came up with this five dimension is actually specifically, but I only realized that afterwards, to try to capture that final element, the capital and the agency. Because those five those five indicators, they really focus on what individual national parties do at transnationally, across levels and across borders. And when I was thinking about the paper after I was reading and preparing this presentation, I was also thinking like maybe those five elements, they're really only focused on the agency element. They're really only focused on that capital of parties and how that can express itself, and that's really just one of the three major elements of the field. And you're absolutely right that the regulatory and normative framework need a lot more elaboration in the paper. So thanks for that comment. It actually sort of confirms my own doubts so far. Now, on the first point, that's the point where I think I will have to disagree most. Although I don't really, I know I don't really have good arguments, in the sense that I think you make a valid point that it would be very interesting to try to use this field to really also to open it up and really encompass the whole party system of the EU. But I just don't see how that would work, in the sense that a field approach is all about, as you know, the definition of Scott that I gave, right? It's all about organizations coming together around something that they actually share, and then interacting more among that little group than among other little groups. And to me, that sounded very logical as, a party family in Europe. Organizations coming together around this, party family idea, this ideology, and interacting more among them than with other parties in other party families. So it really spoke to me as, when I read that, I thought like, well, this is a party family, right? This is a European party family that is organizing itself in a particular field way. So I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea of trying to use this to capture the whole party system. I just don't see how that would work at the moment. How field theory can be used to do that. But I'm very much open to discuss this with you further in the future, absolutely, and I'll be happy to think about it. Yeah. So thanks again for these comments.
Thank you. So the floor is now open for comments, suggestions, and questions. Don't hesitate to raise your hand or to put a comment in the discussion if you want. The first one is Jonathan.
Yes, well, thank you, Gilles. It's a stimulating paper. I agree with almost everything that Ben has said about it. I would like to press you on 2 points, both of them underlyingly conceptual. And they're the 2 core points of your paper, parties and fields. So as regards parties, here the question, you motivate the paper through the democratic deficit and the idea that parties could in principle be the bridge between citizens and the EU or the EU institutions. And I wonder in a way what we can expect from parties in general, not only at the European level. You mentioned, but you don't do anything with the idea that parties are in decline or challenged at the national level. You mentioned falling memberships, and I looked up the membership of parties in Europe. It's pretty striking. There's no party that has more than 600,000 members, and there are not 20 parties that have 100,000 members. And the figures are probably out of date, so they may even be smaller. And the other side, you mentioned falling turnout, but I think what's more relevant is the volatility of electoral behavior and the the weakening of party identification, although people might say that most of that party switching is within common party families. At least that's what the Dutch literature suggests. So if there's any institution in modern democracies which ain't what it used to be, it's political parties. Maybe trade unions would be the other one. So, you know, kind of what role could we really expect parties in a multi-level field to play? Maybe these political parties are more important in European decision-making, in linking national decision-making to European decision-making, especially in the parliament, than they are in linking the voters, the citizens, to the EU institutions. Obviously, if that were true, it would have strong normative implications. And the second point is about fields. And here, I really think, and I'm sure any reviewer is going to tell you this, that you need to go more deeply into sociological field theory. And there are several different competing theories. There's the sociological institutionalist original one, which is mostly about isomorphism. There is the Bourdieusian field theory, which is more structural. It has an agentic dimension, but it's mostly about how actors compete in a given field or framework, but in ways which are shaped by the assets and the socialization that they bring to it. And that's where, I mean, for Bourdieu, habitus is about dispositions which are the result of socialization, not explicit common norms. And then there is the version from Flickstein and McAdam, which focuses is agonistic in character. It focuses on conflicts between incumbents and challengers, and it draws on Bourdieu in emphasizing the different resources that the actors bring to bear in this competition. So I think you need to be more explicit about it. You can synthesize your own version, but I think the implication is indeed that it is the whole party system which is the field, and not the party family, although that could be a subfield within the larger field. So that's my comments.
Thank you, Jonathan. Gilles, do you want to react?
Yeah, sure. Although my reaction will have to be pretty short, in the sense that, I mean, on the second point, I agree. I haven't had the time, and I don't have the sociological background to really say much about field theory in itself. I based most of my knowledge about field theory is based on the work from Crum and Ben Crum and John-Erik Vossen, using their papers. And you're absolutely right that I have to dig deeper into field theory to really explain that. Like I said, this is really a first paper here. So on that point, I can be pretty short. On the first point about what can we actually expect from political parties, well, I think that sort of relates to the final point that Ben also made. Like, is this as good as it gets? Because if you say we should focus on parties as connecting decision-making at the national level with decision-making at the national level, well, we're basically there, right? I mean, that is what parties are doing nowadays. And if that's all we can expect from political parties, then we are at the most democratic, so to speak, that the EU will get, at least from a party democracy perspective. And I would like to challenge that view, that idea that develop the idea more that by acting in a transnational way, by actually actively connecting citizens across levels, across borders, not necessarily vertically across levels, but also horizontally across borders, parties are actually capable of transforming the way citizens think about themselves, about politics, about European politics, and to move towards a kind of European demos, a European people. So I do think there is this transformative potential of political parties. Although, of course, the pressure that parties are under in terms of falling membership, low turnout, and all that, volatility of the voters, that is a real challenge for parties. But I like to also turn that around and say, like, if one of the reasons why people are turning away from political parties and the party democracy model is because, well, I think a lot of people feel that whatever they vote, it doesn't matter, right? Because it's all being decided at the European level. And if parties can actually show that by acting transnationally, by acting actively, how to say this, by being a very active player in the field, right, they can actually translate their voters' preference to across borders and across levels, then citizens might actually start to revalue that political parties and party democracy as a model. I don't know if that answers. I mean, if I'm thinking in the right direction here, but that's what I'm currently thinking.
Responds, but I guess I would wonder, I mean, how much is any of this dependent on the proposals for transnational party lists, which are getting more attention now? In other words, would that be crucial to make this this horizontal or transversal role of parties more effective?
Well, it depends on how you see transnational lists, in the sense that, the way transnational lists are currently under construction, it is still very top down, right? It is still very much, you've got Euro parties deciding their Spitzenkandidaten, and then there's this hope that it will trickle down to the national level, and that people will suddenly start realizing, oh, I'm voting for, I don't know, a Christian Democrat from Germany, or a liberal from France, or whatever, right? That's still there's still this top-down idea in the current way transnational lists are perceived. The way I look at it is more from a bottom-up. I mean, it doesn't have to start with something that we create at the European level and then hope it will trickle down. It has to start from creating incentives for national political parties to, at the national level, or even the local level, start connecting citizens with each other across borders and with the European level. So does it depend on transnational lists? I don't know. I don't think necessarily it does. It all depends on how these lists are organized.
Okay. I don't see any other hand raised, so don't hesitate, but I will take advantage of my position. I know Ben has a few points. Gilles, thank you very much for your paper. Well, I know you work, and I find it very, intriguing. But what I missed, and maybe I misunderstood, but I wasn't sure what you would recommend as a unit of analysis, because sometimes you talk about Euro party, sometimes about EP groups, sometimes about national party. Now you talk about a more bottom-up approach. So I'm not sure whether you would encourage people to start from that bottom-up approach, or how you would concretely studying it, and then more from my own perspective. I've been asked to write a report on Euro parties and what they could mean for European democracy, and I'm very cynical about it. And when I interview people in Euro parties, they don't, so far, even among the most transnational ones, they don't kid themselves by saying that they matter. And it's very much about individual contacts, not so much about the context, not so much about the structure, not so much about the ideology. It's just, whether two people connect and can do stuff, as you say, transnationally. But is this individual level taken into account by the analytical framework that you propose? Because I was talking to Greens last week, and they are really trying, but they say, the most important obstacle is that national parties don't care about Europe. So, you know, what do you want us to do? And then my last comment, and it refers also to one of Ben's comments. I was not fully convinced by your argument about ideology, because you said, well, if they have a thin ideology, it would be more difficult to act cohesively as a Euro party. But does it, you know, it's as a Euro party or as an EP group? And I can think of, you know, if I think about my own study on Eurosceptics, they have a very thin ideology. I don't know how you want to categorize it, but they act a lot transnationally, much more than as a Euro party or even as an EP group. They go to meetings in they don't want Europe, or not this Europe, but they go to meetings in Italy, in Austria, you know, here in Antwerp, they meet, and they're very active transnationally. So I don't know how you reconcile the ideology with the idea of fields. And lastly, I don't know whether you're familiar with the literature on contagion and, you know, spreading of ideas, and also in more party politics, the co-orientation approach to study how parties can influence themselves. And maybe that could also bring ideas on how to make bridge with that kind of literature on fields, and maybe even expand, you know, your research agenda to the party systems at the EU level, because I kind of agree with Ben that they react to within their party family, but they also react to other party families and what they do.
Okay, thank you, Nathalie. Those are some very, very good points. Again, I'll start with your last one. I am reading up on the literature. So for me, it's been very new, because this is I don't think the other people might not know my background, but I'm actually a historian. So I'm not even a political scientist originally. I'm not a sociologist. So for me, this whole sociology literature is pretty new, and I'm reading up. But thanks for the suggestions. I'm definitely looking into it. But you know, still, I like to think of the field as a party family, but we'll get back to that later on. But about yeah, and that actually brings us to, you know, your third point about ideology, right? So what do I mean by thin ideology? It's not so much that it's a thin ideology, such as Euroscepticism or populism or you know, that kind of thing, but more like if the habitus is weak, in the sense that they basically don't agree on a lot, apart from a number of elements. And I think that yes, you're right that many of these Eurosceptic parties are actually very active transnationally. They're cooperating a lot. But if you look at what they actually do at the European level, in the European Parliament, or as a Euro party, right? They've had a lot of attempts at establishing a Euro party, and every time, at least this time, it seems to succeed. But very often it actually failed because of this very weak sort of, you know, common ground between them. And also in the European Parliament, their influence is very limited because they don't vote as a unified bloc, right? So that's basically what I mean. Like if this habitus, this common ideology is pretty weak, we can expect this well, the field, right? This collective of national Eurosceptic parties, for example, to act in a very influential way at the European level. Although your point about the fact that they are nationally, very transnationally active, is an important point there, and I need to think more about how that relates to the field, and how a field's approach would be able to explain that, right? I can't think of anything at the moment, but that is, I think, a very, very important point to take with me. And then your second point, do I consider the individual level? Well, I would like to, but like what Ben already said, you know, one of the big dangers of this kind of attempts is to be overly ambitious, and I think it's already very ambitious. So I sometimes mention in the paper also the individual level, like especially when it comes to capital. I think the individual capital matters a lot, and it could actually be that individual transnationalism is the only kind of transnational that actually matters at the moment. And in that sense, I would like also to come back to Ben's comment that maybe the first thing we should do is to use this model and see, what's actually happening. Before we say like, oh, this is how it works, and I would be in favor of including the individual level as well. Although from my own doctoral research, I've noticed that taking the individual level with you is very, very difficult. As I mean, that as well. In these kind of models and categories and all that. And then I think your first question is one of the biggest ones, actually, one I've been struggling with myself as well, namely, what is actually the unit of analysis here? And the only answer I came up with is that the unit of analysis is actually the field as a whole. And yeah, I know it's an easy way out, I suppose, but the field as a whole is the unit of analysis, and I think that that's why I mean, in the paper I come back to this metaphor quite a lot of archipelagos and islands, right? And I think we should study the archipelago. We should take a step back from studying party politics in Europe, with either studying the Euro Party or studying individual national parties. But rather consider them as this, whole that all fits together. And in that sense, I think that, the field is the unit of analysis. But I'm not very happy with that answer myself. But I would have to consider that. But that's sort of the direction I'm thinking of in right now. And that's also I think one of the reasons why I would like to. I mean, I do like this idea of fields as party families, because the moment you discuss it as a party system, it becomes very, very difficult to capture in a meaningful way that is not purely theoretical and sort of way too big to be of any relevant use. Right, but I mean, these are all very, very, I just want to say these are all very valid points. Thank you so much for all of them. I'm looking forward to, discussing more with several of you about how we can develop this idea more. Thank you.
I know Ben has a few more points, so Ben, go ahead.
Just picking up, I also agree with Jonathan's point that especially in field theory, it's difficult to reduce. You really have to consider both levels of analysis, I think, in the interactions rather than that you can reduce it to one. No, I wanted to pick up on we're going to go back, and I'm in the end still trying to convince you that you really have to think of the system as a whole as a field rather than, but taking a bit of a long road, also picking up on Jonathan's points, why care about parties in the first place? Maybe if you want to look to where European democracy is evolving, maybe you have to look beyond parties. And there I would always kind of go back to Schneider and say, well, it's very hard to think of model democracy in other terms than in terms of parties. And even if I think in Europe, you probably parties can do less than they used to do in their heydays in the nation state. I think it's very difficult to think of democracy in Europe without parties altogether. But actually, I think that coming to what holds this field together and what so you go back to ideology. Well, I would actually say that it's this very notion of what can EU party democracy mean that is the common meaning system that unites these actors. Basically, they're all kind of coming up with ideas about what does it mean to be part of a common EU party democracy. And some, well, actually less than we think, are really committed federalists, but others have very different conceptions. But in a way, in the actions they constitute this very thing, they all engage in European elections and they attach meaning to them, strategically, instrumentally, but also inherently. So I think actually the key issue here is really how these parties themselves conceive of the game that they're engaged in. And at the same time, I think what's crucial is that you cannot think of parties on their own. Parties are, well, they're parts. So they always, well, in a democracy at least, not in China, of course, but in a democracy, they presuppose that there are other parties. Parties can only be defined in a way in antagonism to other parties. That defines a party. So in that sense, I really, no, I keep on banging on that the system dimension is essential because, yeah, parties live by having to compete with other parties and to develop indeed rules of interaction and indeed the degree to which they want to indeed pool resources to the European level in engaging with these in this kind of competition. So I would say that actually the key issue here is really how they frame this very game that they're involved in. What is this party democracy, and what are we willing to bring to it, and do we care? As Nathalie says, well, many politicians may not care at all. And then finally, I want to amplify the point that Nathalie, of course, made and should have made, and that's of course that there are very interesting examples here, and I think you underexploit them outside of the mainstream. So it's really interesting. I would encourage you not only to mention the Verhofstadts and the von der Leyens, but indeed to highlight how, in a way, of course, Marine Le Pen has a very prominent position in this field. And she actually maybe have a lot of capital, maybe not in the traditional ways of being a Spitzenkandidat in any viable way. But in a way, I think she plays a role in the shadows in what's happening in Sweden. So there are interactions, I think, that are triggered actually by the field, and that's, I think, why this is a productive notion. But it also, I think, forces you to think out of the ordinary sources of capital, of prestige, of authority, and to actually see how these dynamics are exploited by different actors in different ways. And I think in that sense, indeed, the extreme right, to some extent also the extreme left, are very interesting because indeed, well, from a certain perspective, they seem to be ambivalent, but actually I think they're pretty effective and they know very well what they're doing.
Right. Thank you, Ben. We'll have to talk more about systems versus families. But I think one of the reasons why I've been thinking about them in terms of party families is because of the question I initially asked myself. In the sense that the question I asked myself when I started thinking about this is, what actually is a European party? Because when we talk about the party model, right, we always think in terms of what we know as national parties, engaging with each other, etc. But the way I was thinking, and that's also what I described in the paper and said in the presentation here, the way we think about what a party is at a European level makes no sense when you compare it to federal parties or party networks, right? So I started to think about my initial goal was really to think about what actually is a European party, right? A Euro party, what is it? A party of parties, but that's not enough. I mean, it's, you know, that's the frame by which I approached it, and I think that's why I decided to, you know, use field as to have it focus on party families, because the question is what is a European family, and today they are still, of course, engaged, I mean, divided by ideology. So in that sense, I completely agree with you that, of course, parties can't live without other parties, right? And they always interact with each other, also outside their ideological family. But if you look at the European level, what a European party is, it's still, I think, something that is ideologically driven, in a way. I mean, it's no surprise. I mean, that's why the socialists sit together, and liberals and the Christian Democrats and all that. You know, I mean, there are a few parties who might switch, but you won't see the Social Democrats sit with the Aldi group, right? That's not going to happen. So I wouldn't discard ideology. that fast. And in a way, maybe the European party system is a field of fields, you know, or there is actually sort of coordination going on, or competition going on between fields, and that would be, you know, a bit like what I don't know if it's Jonathan or you who said it, that these party families can be subfields within the bigger field, and I'll be totally open to that idea. But then, of course, you've got the question, like, what are the central institutions of that bigger field? Would that be the parliament, or how would that work? So I'm definitely open to the idea, but my original question was, what is a European party? And I think from that perspective, also, so sort of I'm switching it around, like, also from the perspective of individual parties or individual party families, also they can be seen as fields in themselves, and maybe indeed interacting in an even bigger field. So I'm not opposed to the idea, but I'd have to, because that would also make the model even bigger, you know. And if we go from a model that is party system, and then including Nathalie's suggestion of actually including the individual level, that's going to be huge. And I don't think if that I mean, I don't think my brain can handle that, to be fair. But yeah, it's definitely worth thinking about. So let's see if there was anything else. No, for you know, about the first question you asked, why should we care about parties at all? That is a very normative question, and maybe, I mean, I was really inspired also to write this by the work from Fabio Wolkenstein. I don't know if you've met him, and he also makes very strongly the case that parties are actually the best placed organizations to have this kind of transnational politics and transnationalization of politics, much more than, for example, trade unions or civil society, because parties can actually mobilize citizens. Of course, the moment parties lose that capacity to actually mobilize citizens, then you can really ask the question, what's the point, right? And I think that's a relevant question to which I, at this point, don't have an answer, but it's definitely worth discussing it further. And I'm sure we'll have a lot more talks in the future. So thanks again.
Well, thank you very much to Gilles and Ben, and to all of you, of course, for this first seminar. So Jonathan and I are pleased to invite you to the next one, which will take place on the 27th of October at the same time as today, so 4 p.m. Paris of Brussels or Amsterdam time. And it will be on national government and the enforcement of the rule of law, with a presentation by Carlos Closa and Gisela Hernandez. Have a good afternoon, everyone, and see you next time.
Thank you so much, everyone. Goodbye.